Morning, everyone. Welcome to our first webinar series as part of COVID-19 Insight Circle Initiative, CIC. I'm very happy to see everyone on board this morning. We were definitely very encouraged to get almost 300 Circle members from across the 3 countries. So that's pretty exciting. Now, for those of you that's not too familiar with CIC and got the link to this live session, I will elaborate a little bit more this morning. But just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. So first and foremost, throughout the session, we do encourage everyone to ask questions. You will see the question block on the right-hand side if you're not too familiar with Microsoft Teams. We'll be trying to ask them, respond to them as we proceed with the session this morning. Next is that if any of you guys are faced with any technical issues, please do prompt us and our team will try to address them. We also realize that now that everyone's working from home, that there may be bandwidth issues in terms of your connectivities and you may get bumped off. So if you do get bumped off, just click on the link again. But please don't forget to click on the live button at the bottom of the screen so you can get back to the live session in real time. Otherwise, you'll be seeing the recorded version. So do take note of that. So now that we've got that out of the way, please allow me to introduce myself again. My name is Ashran. I'm the CEO for Dattel. And I've got 2 very special people this morning. Ain, who is our Regional Head of Client Engagement, and Shubho, a good friend, who is the President Director for Densu Indonesia. So this is going to be the group, and I hope that, like I said earlier on, as we continue with the discourse this morning, that we will also be getting your inputs and your reactions throughout the conversation, and I'll be picking them up so that we can actually be a little bit more interactive as opposed to one way. True to the spirit of CIC. Next, please. So again, I mentioned CIC a couple of times. Just to recap with everyone, CIC was an initiative that we put together to bring communities together. It is a data-driven business support group. And by nature of that, our session of webinar this morning takes on that spirit. We want to focus on pretty much the sharing aspects of things, the experiential and things, and the collaborative spirit. And not just that, what we're putting on the table also is that all Circle members are going to be receiving access to our consumer intelligence console for 1 month. And then you'll also be having access to the reports that we will be publishing. In terms of the bi-weekly webinars, every month there'll be 2. One will be insights like we have this morning, and the other one will be an experience sharing from one of the Circle members, as we think this is actually very important. Last but not least is actually the research collaboration. As during the course of this session, there'll be things that we discuss. There'll be input that's been presented. We do want to hear from you. And not just being rhetorical about it, we want to hear from you so that we can incorporate them within the future studies that we'll be doing, so that it makes better sense for all the Circle members. So that's just a recap with regards to CIC. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our corporate partners, namely Densu in Indonesia, Bridgeham Indonesia, Magic, MDEC, Mix Communications, Media Prima Digital, Marketing Oops, and also MRCA. Thank you very much for your support, and we do hope for your continued support and many more to come. Now, let's get on a bit more warmed up with regards to the things that we're going to be doing today. So the conversation today is going to be centered around three sets of data. Number one is from our pre-COVID-19 consumer state of mind study. The second one is actually the COVID-19 Reimagining consumer study. And the third aspect is going to be from the lens of our consumer intelligence. It's going to be the mashup of these three that's going to be the course of this session and the continued sessions that we're going to have after this. Now, some of you may be wondering, why did Dattel put on the title Reimagining Consumers, Insecurities, and the New Normal in ASEAN? Reimagining consumers has always been something that we propagate as part of our DNA. The bottom-up approach is very essential to us, and hence we continue that spirit in this exercise. Insecurities and the new normal comes from our premise that insecurities affects priorities, yeah, and priorities affects behavior. Hence, insecurities we see as a potential marker for us to understand the new normal. And markers are important so that when we're looking at the whole gamut of data that is coming in and on the various types of perspective, that we're able to anchor things and see how levers are actually influencing behaviors. And we see this pretty much impacting four areas of changes, being personal, social, business, and government. And so without further ado, I'd like to get the ball rolling with getting Shubho to kind of expand a little bit more with regards to this aspect of changes and kind of set the stage in our conversation moving forward. Over to you, Shubho.
Thank you, Ashran. Good morning, everybody. It's nice to be here with all of you. This staying at home and working from home typically gets our minds working in different directions. And while I went through this whole conversation around what will be the new normal, of late, I've really been wondering if the world actually needs to discover what we are calling a new normal, or is it that we've been living this for a while already and the time has now come to accept it and let it get established? I say this because, you see, capitalism has been the defined way for people to do business for over 250 years and more now. And the COVID pause has perhaps just given us the time to realize that it is dying because its wheels have been stopped in its tracks by just a virus. The resultant of that is that we probably need to recalibrate our lives to reflect upon how COVID has actually changed it. And as Ashran mentioned, these four aspects become very critical: personal change, social change, business change, and change in expectation and delivery of governance. But at the core of all of this certainly has to lie personal change, because that's where it always begins. And when I say personal, I talk about both family and myself. So as we move forward, let's see what Ayn has to say about personal change coming into our lives.
Thanks, Pak Shubho. Okay, so we'll kind of dive straight into it and looking into consumer state of mind. We want to kind of set the stage. With this study, basically the data was collected on between the 6th of April to the 12th. So it was within a 1-week period where we looked into consumer state of mind and also certain consumption behaviors as well. So the first thing that we asked was whether or not what's people understanding of COVID-19 is, and where they stand with regard to the kind of government measures that have been put in place. So what we see is generally people are erring on the side of caution. People would prefer to think of that possibility that anybody can be infected. So there is that fear that is affecting everybody. But what's more interesting is when we start looking at the differences in terms of how they perceive the government measures to protect livelihoods versus protecting lives. So the difference here lies in how the Thais seem to think, because 1 out of 3 Thai people are actually far more concerned with the ability to earn a living rather than the ability to survive from the disease. So it brings an interesting nuance to where the priorities are going to be shifting, and how those priorities are going to be recontextualized or recalibrated, for, as in Pak Shubo's words, in the months to come, so to speak. So one of the things that we looked at, I'm just kind of moving back a little bit to what we looked at in our pre-COVID study. So we were looking at individual priorities here. So as also as Ashran mentioned, where we're talking about insecurities, they are pretty much affected. Priorities will be affected based on insecurities. So this is to take stock of where people wanted to focus the next 12 months on before COVID came and upended everything else. So we can see that the focus has always been largely on family, on health, and also on finances. But we don't expect that to change in general. However, the contextualizing of the priorities may, because of how government measures and how the way of life has to change, and therefore the way people perceive time with family is going to change, the way people perceive physical health is going to change, the way people perceive paying off debt, and so on and so forth. All these different priorities are going to change in terms of their context, but in general will still be in place. But maybe you have something to add on this one.
Yeah, I think this January chart is very interesting to me because when I look at Malaysia, I find that the colored boxes pretty much talk of family importance and success as a family person. Indonesia and Thailand are very similar, and I'm not surprised. But what is interesting to me is that there is a sense of individualism that seems to be coming in both in Indonesia and Thailand, where career advancement in Indonesia, which is more an individual-oriented aspiration, has come in, whereas Thailand has talked about mental health as an important concern. Now, I'm sure these are great contexts within which to look at the impending changes that are coming up, because the question really is life getting recalibrated? How will that affect businesses? So let's jump in and see what more April has to say to us.
I would imagine also that basically when discussing here, perhaps I would like to invite the businesses to, or the participants to think about how then do you contextualize what you do in terms of your, either as a consumer facing business or as an organization thinking about their employees. How do you contextualize what you do with what your employees and consumers want to prioritize, and how do you kind of help them to follow through with those priorities? So if you frame it that way, also that may help. So let's look into the areas of focus for this particular session. We covered a lot of things in our study, but for today's session, we will be looking at 3 aspects on their personal state of mind, which relate back to the priorities, and this will be the aspects of insecurity that we're going to be focusing on. And then finally, towards the end, we're going to look at some consumption uncertainties, basically in terms of how people perceive their plans for the next 3 months, whether they intend to proceed with them or not, and also just a little bit of shopping behavior under COVID-19. We will be covering more as we go along in the subsequent webinars, as we have more data that we are able to, more time series data where we will start making comparisons and tracking changes. But for now, let's kind of set the scene a little bit. So first thing, of course, is family. So what we asked here were several statements for people to state their agreement or disagreement with these statements. So the first thing that we see, of course, establishes pretty much that people believe that they have a good relationship with their family, and that positive sentiment is highest among Malaysians, reflecting very much what Pak Shubo had mentioned in terms of priorities, where Malaysians are very family oriented, whereas for Indonesians and Thais, there is a little bit of individualism in terms of what they want to focus on. But this is where the dynamics seem to change. So the part about family here is really to understand the individual's role in the family or in the household itself. So we start seeing the dynamics kind of shifting a little bit when we're asking about decision making. So not everybody plays that role of collective decision making. Not all good family relationships involve family participation in decision making. So it demonstrates that shift in roles. Some people are deciders or decision makers, and some people may just be those who just follow. So it's a question of do then we see people surrendering individualism for collective survival instead? Will we possibly see then, if for example, due to necessity, there is a growth of shift from nuclear families to extended or adult family units, which means more family members trying to live together to support each other, then does that mean then the role in decision making also shifts and the dynamics within family members also shift? And this is another indicator when we ask people if they have enough money to treat their family to a meal. This kind of demonstrates the shift between the provider and the dependent in the family. So it's a question of, does the family play the role of supporting the individual, or is the individual playing the role of supporting the entire family? So as we see more people saying that they don't have enough money to treat family, then we can expect basically a lot more people are actually playing the role of dependent rather than provider. So that's my take on this, on what we have so far. Pak Shubho, where do you see this going for businesses?
Yeah, and it's very interesting to look at the pink boxes at the bottom, which really talk about strongly disagree or somewhat disagree. And I find it pretty fascinating that those boxes have increased in sufficient number. To me, it starts to point towards hierarchy within decision-making becoming more hierarchy-oriented rather than personal. I think perhaps when fear grips, we all tend to follow a leader, and we've seen it both from governmental sanctions as well as community leaders coming out. But business-wise, it seems to suggest to me an important recalibration between needs and wants. And I think that recalibration is key to formulating any business strategies. I think it needs to bring in this aspect of reflecting upon one's own product and see how we really feature in a consumer's life, because that's what COVID has really done. It's changed the way we look at what we need and what we want. So, for example, will personal vanity products have the same importance if the world continues to wear masks post-COVID? Will point of sale hygiene become a very, very important aspect to define where people will shop? Should marketers look for a recalibration of their pricing strategies? Because again, affordability is likely to become an important aspect, or maybe even production capabilities. So all these things start to emerge as we dig a little deeper, and perhaps our views on health will clarify some of that, Ayn.
Yeah, sure. So when we looked at health, of course, we always start with a general overview, whether people believe that they practice a healthy lifestyle. And what's interesting here is that we do see high levels of agreement among Indonesians and Malaysians, but an actual decrease among the Thais in their ability to live healthy. So we've got 11% who used to, in the pre-COVID study back in January, who used to say that they were able to live a healthy lifestyle, now seeing that they're not. Or saying that they're not. So this is a sharp contrast in terms of what's happening between Thailand and what's happening in Malaysia and Indonesia. But as we dive deeper into the concerns towards their physical health, what we see is that, interestingly, Malaysians have far more concerns, or are more likely to be concerned. But at the same time, those concerns are not as connected to their living conditions. So Malaysians, only about 27% say that the living conditions are a little bit challenging for them to abide by COVID-19 health and hygiene rules, which suggests that basically the safety and health physical concerns are with outside exposure rather than at-home conditions. So Malaysians are more likely to actually retreat to the homestead and feel more comfortable actually living in their own personal space rather than being exposed to a lot more physical contact and other unknown exposures outside. It's different in Thailand though. Thailand, more than half say that it is difficult for them given their living conditions. So for the Thai people, it is more for them, their interest actually lies in the ability to go out, the ability to earn a living, and the ability to go back, get their lives back to normal, so to speak. And when we look at this also kind of tracks with how they feel, how the Thais feel about their mental well-being. And again, kind of goes back to what we had seen earlier with regard to their priorities, where mental health was one of the top 5 priorities for the year. So while Malaysians and Indonesians seem to have similar sort of mental resilience, which may relate to, again, relationship with authority and also relationship with religion, we see that the Thais are far more concerned with how well they are coping mentally. And finally, when we look at sense of concern over family health, this is where we see Indonesians actually feeling a greater sense of concern. And what this kind of, if I were to summarize this, what we see is that different countries, the population of different countries are focusing on different aspects of health. Where Indonesians are more concerned by the family health, Malaysians are far more concerned by their physical well-being, but not so much about physical well-being while at home. And it's more about the external exposure and feeling more safe at home and more protected at home. Thais are far more concerned with their mental health and would therefore be looking for solutions to address that, which may be very closely connected to their ability to earn a good livelihood, a balanced livelihood. So this already kind of gives you a sense of what businesses, I believe, what businesses would be able to focus on if you're talking about from the health aspect. And it doesn't mean that these are just businesses that are in the health industry. I would imagine that this actually kind of shapes the messaging and how you want to focus your priorities on where people are interacting. So for Malaysians, their interactions are going to be very home focused, and for Thais, their interactions are more concerned with actually being able to live a regular life as normal. But you have some thoughts on how businesses would need to tackle this?
A couple of thoughts here, and I'm just going to share them as they come. I think the first part of it is, as you mentioned, in terms of the messaging and the value that brands create around the current living well and living healthy, and that aspect of it. And I know all brands are not necessarily geared up in that messaging space, but I think it's important for us to understand that consumers are looking for support and value from brands, so messaging is important. The other aspect for those of us who work in advertising is a shift in the way in the media that we use for the messaging. And I think that's going to be a critical aspect, because that comes into play very much more as we see people being more homebound and staying in. But most importantly to me, this is a reflection of what the new corporate culture ought to be. I think this has more implications for us as employers and how we behave, because companies which have more employee-sensitive benefits will clearly have the edge moving forward. And if we want to attract good people to our companies, we need to have a seriously interesting HR policy. Unfortunately, of late, a lot of HR has become more general administration. I think this is the moment for HR to come back big and influence the quality of people and the retention of people who live in companies for longer durations, just because one important concern, both for self and family, will get mitigated with good HR corporate policies. So perhaps we could move on to personal finance. And
sure. Okay, so I think in this regard, I think everybody can already anticipate that this is going to look a bit like a bloodbath when it comes to personal finance. In general, we do see that there is an increase in people feeling less content with their financial situation. But particularly hit is the Thais. Again, it kind of reflects, and when you look back at all the previous data that we've already shared, it makes perfect sense, and that's why it has that impact. So financial security has an impact on relationship with family. It also has an impact on their relationship with their own personal, physical as well as mental health. So it's not just the negative sentiment overall, but if you look at the strong negative sentiment, the strong disagree, you can see that significant jump, especially in Thailand and Indonesia. So, and the growing concern over their earning ability, over the ability to pay off debts, and ability to just manage their day-to-day living expenses. And as things start to change in terms of what needs to be part of the living expenses, that's also going to be affected. We see in this next slide. Basically what we see here is that people, so the statement here is whether people feel that their financial situation is steady enough to cover their basic needs comfortably. So there are two aspects here. One is the fact that, again, we see that rise, but the other aspect I think that's more important is to redefine what consists or what comprises basic needs. As the way of life has to change, and as we take into account the fact that this public health crisis now means that we have to do things differently and we have to interact differently, that means our necessities are also changing. So that basic needs, the repertoire of basic needs also has to change, has to shift, and definitely would have an impact on the share of wallet in terms of what is now considered your basket of essentials. Then, of course, if already we're seeing people's inability to cover their basic needs, what more about the ability to save? So we can see that it's across the board. All three countries are experiencing very strong negative sentiment. The strong disagree has increased significantly. It has doubled in Malaysia. It has tripled in Indonesia. And and we're seeing the negative sentiment pushing the positive sentiment in Thailand all the way back, because now only about 22% are able to save, put away monthly savings. So again, whatever this kind of depends also a lot on government measures. Because it will influence how people change, how people live their lives in terms of how consumers are going to interact with products and services. But essentially, I suppose this is something that the banks and financial institutions will be rather concerned with, because obviously it's important for people to, as much as possible, to be able to generate enough money to be able to put away savings and to be able to, this part and parcel of it. Of course, then that also comes back to the fact that when you've got strong negative sentiment against ability to save, that means people are now dipping into whatever that is in their financial savings. So as now that Malaysia and Thailand have lifted or eased their restriction measures, that means that people are hopefully able to resume earning an income. They are able to resume and able to recalibrate and reorganize their priorities when it comes to purchases and spending, and also able to somehow no longer dip into their savings, but instead try as much as possible to preserve the existing savings, should that be needed for other emergencies in the future. So of course, if the economy is unable to if the governments are unable to maintain this level of slowly reopening or this easing of measures and have to revert back to previous measures, then we will see that sentiment, of course, becoming negative, even more negative as time goes by. So that remains to be seen in terms of how the government is going to react. What are your comments on this one?
Very, very quickly, I think you've covered pretty much everything. I'd just say this. I think on the one hand, the psychographics of the situation, and on the other hand, the financials, pressures on both ends, will really change spend patterns, and some of those spend patterns are likely to be permanent. I mean, the easiest example is to look at ourselves and look at what we consider essential and what we consider non-essential. And I think a degree of future anxiety to lead to a fall in indulgence goods, in some kinds of big spends, travel, entertainment, as we've already seen. But I think this is where good corporate strategy can prevent a bloodbath. I think it's very important for corporations to relook at their pricing strategies, because I think that's going to come across right through the industries, and it's important for us to realize that we need to get through 2020 so that we can take advantage of 2021. So yeah, I would think the key variable that this pulls up as for corporations is to seriously re-examine pricing strategies.
If I can add on to you a little bit, Shubho, an extension to revisiting or re-looking at pricing strategies, right? Looking at, most countries have a very strong negative sentiment about their ability to be able to save for the future, which then affects consumption, right? Perhaps for companies or brands that has the ability or could potentially work towards that ability is where they provide an ease of cash flows in terms of actually passing it on to the clients or the consumers themselves, because everyone is looking at the now. And if you're able to give that comfort level, perhaps, then the consumers would be willing to consider a little bit more from a longevity perspective in dealing with those brands. So that's just a quick reactionary thought from what you were saying just now.
Yeah, Ashran, if I may just add one little bit to that.
Yeah, sure.
When I say pricing strategies, I don't necessarily mean go cheaper.
Right.
I'm saying justify the value the brand has in people's lives. What it really means is to, instead of going into pushing for panic sales even from a corporate side, I think it's important to be intelligent about how we price it and therefore what value we provide, because it's important for us. Everybody's looking for straws to clutch onto, and if a brand provides it, so much the better.
Right. Great, great. And at this point, I would like to definitely encourage our audience at this present moment. I am sure most of you that I see come from a variety of sectors, from automotive, FMCGs, some are ad agencies, so you're dealing with clients from multiple sectors. We've got companies from health and beauty. We've got companies that's from the hospitality sector, hypermarkets and malls. And I'm sure looking at some of these aspects, while some of these elements may be a bit more gut feel prior to this or more what has impacted you, I do hope that this numbers has triggered a little bit more thoughts in the conversation thus far, and to kind of also get you guys to prompt some questions or even a different perspective, be it even disagreement to some of the things that perhaps you are saying, and we would love to be able to hear that. Yeah. So please do, and let's go on, Ayn.
Okay. So this is where we're going to talk about the future a little bit, not too far into the future. We're looking at basically a 3-month period here. What we asked people were basically they made plans to do any of these purchase activities or social activities in the next 3 months, social or community activities. And we see that in general, anything between 50 to 60% of the population have actually made those plans. So we're talking about a big chunk of the population being forced to reconsider what they intend to do in the next 3 months. As you can see on the left, we're talking about purchases, and on the right, it's really about a lot of those social functions, while a lot of people are talking about attending social events and travel. And of course, we can imagine right now that travel, particularly overseas travel, is going to be badly hit for some time. Will take some time to recover. And is that the case? We'll look at this on a country by country basis in terms of whether they intend to proceed, to continue, or to cancel. So in Indonesia, we do see that optimism, if you notice the green line, the optimism does prevail when it comes to purchase activities. So the purchase of items, including moving or buying a house or renovating a house, vehicle purchase, furniture, so home-related activities as well as digital device, it still exceeds, the intent to proceed in the next 3 months still exceeds the intent to cancel. It's only when we see certain social activities where people then, the enthusiasm for it dampens quite significantly, but not as significant when you see what it looks like in Malaysia. So Malaysia paints a completely different picture in the context that the risk appetite is virtually non-existent. We see more people inclined to cancel their plans, but even more so, far greater intent to cancel social activities. So as you can see, purchase activities are not, purchase activities may actually bounce back a little bit faster, but it's the social activities that are the ones that are impacted the most. Not to mention, of course, travel, because travel is the one that also has the biggest margin between proceed and cancel, or what we consider a confidence score, so to speak, and we'll share that with you in a slide later on. So what we imagine here for Malaysia is people are still again coming back to focusing on activities in the home, physical contact to be kept to a minimum, and really just focusing on day-to-day activities and day-to-day needs. In Thailand, what's interesting here is that despite very low consumer confidence, I think the numbers right now, as of beginning of April, they were as low as last seen in the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s. So one would expect that when consumption of FMCG goods and day-to-day essentials drops, then you would also see a drop in the intent to purchase or purchasing of larger items, high involvement items such as vehicles and property. And yet the pattern seems to suggest differently, and that may be because we are not in a similar situation as other financial crises. This is a financial crisis that is brought on by a health crisis in particular. So that shift is, while there are shifts on essential needs, in terms of consumption, but there are also other pressing needs in terms of creating your own personal space. So we are seeing those shifts being translated here in the fact that people are still looking to create their own personal space for safety purposes. So this is what we were talking about when we were mentioning confidence score, where you can see at least in the same page the patterns and the different patterns between the countries and how that actually is going to be affected over the long run and why these changes are happening as well. I believe, Pak Shubha, you have some thoughts on this one, right?
Yeah, it's interesting that in trying to flatten the COVID curve, we've all managed to flatten the economy. And everybody and all reports that I read seems to paint every person and every economy with the same color and the same general brush. I like this understanding of spend patterns here, or prospective spend patterns here, because this bit actually depends upon the cultural and social makeup of each of these countries. And for example, if I just say that Malaysia is more a middle-income country as against Indonesia or Thailand, which are lower-income countries. If I look at the fact that the median age in Thailand is 40, whereas the median age for Indonesia and Malaysia are 29, 30, you will start to appreciate why these nuanced changes come about. So just to give you an example, Eid al-Fitr, which is coming up, it's the biggest festival in Indonesia, is a time of great spend. Now, culturally, if Indonesia was to go ahead and spend, Indonesians continue to spend big during Eid al-Fitr, what we will see is that this confidence level will diminish very soon after, because recovery of that money may not be as easy as it used to be in previous years. In Malaysia and Thailand, for example, the governmental efforts to provide a safety net for the bottom 40% of the population, which has shown pretty optimistic dividends, might need to continue a little longer just to make sure that the economy doesn't fall off the table. Because even while people stop spending on vanity, travel, indulgence, and so on and so forth, it's best for business to try and see how they can ride out the year at a general level and survive to make it to 2021, where I do predict a boom coming up sometime mid-year.
Mm-hmm. So the thing, of course, is because with the easing of restriction measures, it also depends on how well people abide by the standard operating procedures and the new way of doing things outside of the home, to ensure that we don't have to go back to lockdown status or lockdown mode, which would definitely then make that recovery way harder.
However, Ryan, I'll just add this. I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking about in this draft is about not forgetting to factor in local cultural nuances into business plans, because they can have a significant impact on how people view the future and how they look at their present state of health and financial comfort. So to everybody, please, when you do your business strategies, do not forget local cultural nuances.
All right. Okay, so let's move on to the last aspect of the presentation today, which is basically on the shopping behavior. We're just going to cover two aspects here.
Right. Can I just pause you for a while before you move on to the shopping behavior stuff?
Okay.
I just wanted to know, I mean, thank you guys for actually putting up some questions. So before we get into this last segment, so that we don't go too far off, Shubo, you brought up about HR policies and stuff just now. So we've got a question from our participant, Sherry, about how does a company identify or groom employees post-COVID scenario, and what are some steps companies should look out for? An interesting question indeed, very HR related to some extent, but as President Director of Dentsu, I guess, it'll be interesting to hear your perspective on this one.
Yeah, like I said, Sherry, thanks for the question. It's incisive and insightful. I think, as I said before, I think one of the things that has happened to HR, unfortunately, is that it has gotten relegated to general administration, and that's not really HR. And the reason I say that is, for example, it is very, very easy in today's day and age to keep a pulse on employees. It's very easy to look at that data and compare it over periods of time. In Dentsu Indonesia, we've even attempted to model it into when will people leave and what are the chances of who will leave. It's not very necessarily very robust, but over periods of time that you collect that data, that makes it extremely helpful to try and see how well a company is geared to look after the fears and aspirations of people, rather than relegated merely to a single point in the year when we go ahead and do appraisals and we decide, one boss decides what everyone should do. I think HR policies regarding health, regarding family well-being, regarding safety, regarding sentiment becomes extremely critical post-COVID. As I've seen, there are companies where people are facing mental health issues due to isolation. Is there a counseling program? Is there a direct helpline that someone can pick up? Would the insurance policy of the company cover a COVID or a pandemic test? Does it cover family health on that front? Does it allow us to have counseling sessions which don't necessarily have a prescription? There are a lot of these aspects that can come up, and it's only in a crisis when things break down that we realize that we've swept some of those things off the table. And it's been a great realization in the last 6-7 weeks that HR facilities and policies need to be way more employee friendly than they currently are as practiced.
Thanks, Shubho. And I must say also, I think in crisis also you see the gems within your companies probably shining through a lot more that you may or may not have realized prior to this. So let's move on. There's a couple more questions before I let you proceed, Ain, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
So there was a question in regard to whether these slides are going to be downloadable or not. So for everyone's benefit, yes, it will be. It is only accessible to CIC members, so if you're not yet, please do register for that. There was a question that was asking about sample size. It will be in the report where we do the breakdowns in terms of distribution of this. So please download that too. One question that was interesting here, although it's anonymous, it's asking pretty much, the question is, any insights on change of financial habit due to the COVID-19? For example, type of investment in this new normal, or use of digital payment, or more of search online promo on online retailers. Because of this report is little expected. So I hope this next section, anonymous, we'll be able to address some of the things that you're highlighting over here. And if it triggers anything else from there on, please feel free to come back and add more questions. So Ain, please proceed with this.
Yeah, it is an interesting question. I would say that actually, while what we're showing here is behavior that is at the beginning of April. It does not necessarily say this is the new normal because we're still in a transition. It's still a tumultuous period. It's still a transitional period. So it will take some time, I would imagine, before people settle into what is considered a new normal. So any behavior or any activity that we are sharing right now is not an indication that this is how things are going to be for the rest of the year. I think that part is kind of important to bear in mind. However, of course, as Dattel continues to, because it is at the core of Dattel's business for us to collect data continuously on consumer behavior. So I think I would imagine that we would be able to see some settling of behaviors further down, maybe in the third or fourth quarter of the year, where then we start to see patterns start to stabilize. But at this point, I would imagine that I would say that a lot of this is still subject to a lot of volatility as government measures are in place and people are trying to find their balance in terms of financial stability. So moving on to this shopping behavior. So we're going to cover only just two aspects here, which is as questioned about in terms of payment methods. So what we see so far, this is across all the three countries, adoption of non-cash payment methods during this time period is still low. We see for most of these other activities, it is still very much cash driven. So these are just some of the categories or the purchase categories where there is some non-cash payment methods. Otherwise, for a lot of them, it is really concentrated on cash as the main payment method still. So this is one aspect. And the other interesting thing here is that while we do know that a lot of people have been talking about e-commerce is the way to go, but it's also important to take into account of the people who still depend on physical stores, the people who still go to physical stores. And we see here that while online shopping at this point has reached 30% of the population, and yes, it will. We can expect this to grow. We do see also that there's still 70% of the population, at least, that is still just going to mainly physical stores, which means that they're not ready yet to make that jump to go to start purchasing online. So perhaps because one of the things is that switching to e-commerce and online shopping does require also switching to non-cash payment methods. The other thing also is because non-essential spending has slowed down. And another possible reason is that, and I think perhaps we all can agree on this one, is what we used to take for granted, and the fact that going to the shops and going outside has become a precious opportunity for a lot of people under many weeks of living under restricted movements or lockdown or partial lockdowns, whatever the term we want to use. So that inability to go places that you used to go, that limited movement does make that act of going to physical stores more important during that time than any other time before. Whether perhaps Pak Shubho, you want to comment whether this is something that you see will change over time?
Yeah, well, look, I think it's a phenomenon that is more induced by the current situation, where using cash provides greater control. We all know how credit cards and online payments can keep running away from us. So I think people are just being a little careful. Secondly, I also think that as we move forward with the comfort and the trust that is being built by all of us being so much online all the time, I just think online shopping, even if you look at the hygiene aspect, being to crowded places and so on, I think online shopping is here to stay and only grow. I think what we're seeing right now in terms of physical stores is perhaps the only release most people have in the whole day from just stepping out of their homes. So that's what they are taking up right now. And cash has exactly the same phenomenon to me. I think it's limited to the period of the lockdown and the fear that most of us are going through right now.
So basically, as financial liquidity improves, then we may actually see the shift to online purchases growing even at a faster rate.
Yeah, I think so. And Ashran, if I may just try
to
answer the question that you asked earlier from the person who talked about it. It's a very interesting question. Here's the way I look at it on investments in products. Here's the way I look at it. I think most governments will look for more money from the market. I think what's likely to happen is, therefore, financial institutions need to come up with products that are more short-term oriented. There will be fluctuating interest rates because of changes in government, quick changes in government monetary and fiscal policies. So there is every chance that the kinds of investment products that are likely to catch the fancy of people are those with short-term returns, those which are easily cashed in, so that if there is a need for liquidity, one can get to that. And there will be products like insurance, which will become more important and more relevant to us. So I think there is a whole case book that can be opened up in that conversation. But very quickly, I would think mutual funds, short-term returns, shortened term fixed deposits with higher interest rates will all become pretty popular, both to mitigate some insecurity about the future, allow fear of the very long term to come in. So, yeah.
Oh, no, just now your line was breaking up, so that's fine.
So no, I was just saying, my father probably kept a lot of his money to buy a car at the end of his life and a house and marriage and education of his children. I don't think we're going to look like that. I think moving forward, it's going to be a lot more immediate and short term, and therefore it'll also allow us to be more consumptive, which will regenerate the economy and put the money back into a greater velocity than it currently has.
If I may add, so basically, while we're not looking into financial investments at this point, in terms of consumer behavior at the very least, but definitely it's something that we can look into to add into the study.
Great.
Yeah.
There's a couple more questions, but let's proceed first with the...
Okay. I think, basically in terms of the data, that's what we have to share for this session. We will definitely have more in the following, in the next webinar planned in June, if I'm not mistaken.
Great. There is, before I pass it back to you, Shubho, there's one question that relates back to a bit what you were talking earlier about efficiency and cost. So there's one question that says here, what are your thoughts regarding some vital positions in the businesses players that are being laid off as a result of efficiency? Many companies prefer to retain middle roles to reduce cost. Is that expected to happen at the moment? This is an interesting question. Did you hear me? Do you need me to repeat that?
I think it's a fantastic question.
Yeah.
No, I got that. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I think it's a fantastic question. Well asked. I think all the three questions have been pretty incisive. Here's the thing. If you had waited just a minute more, we would have gone into the summary of it. I do mention it. One of the things that's become critical right now is to get through 2020. And I think the roles that are being merged, the roles that are being changed from complete very high seniority to middle management is likely to continue. One of the things that businesses in the past have done is that they've kept the top and they've kept the bottom and they've removed middle management. And that led to a lot of hollowness in the middle. I think what is happening now is far more interesting, because what's happening is there is greater primacy of middle management role, both from the point of view of the ability to stay relevant and connected, as well as career ambition. And I think while it goes under the name of cost cutting, I think it adds greater value and flexibility to businesses by doing that.
Right. And Shubho, please dovetail into the conclusion of things too.
Right. I'll do this very quickly. If you could just put up that chart, I'll run through it. I mean, basically the kind of conversations we've had are primarily around the changing dynamics of essentials and non-essentials. So for business strategists, I would suggest please rethink and seriously look at which one of these categories you fall into. and therefore use intelligent pricing policies to deal with that. Secondly, household products will start to emerge with more collective usage than individual indulgence. Take a look at how you might want to look at both pricing and sizing of SKUs, because there'll be a lot more household buying rather than individuals buying. I think healthcare investments will rise. I think short-term benefits, I mentioned it, are the kinds of products that the financial industry will is likely to bring in. I think vanity products and conspicuous consumption is likely to slow down. I mean, how many people bought shoes and garments in the last 6 weeks would be worth a look into. But I do think that immediately post opening of the lockdown, there will be some spurt in all of that, because there are pent up desires which will be released. But I don't think that's going to remain for very long. It'll probably normalize at a lower level than pre-COVID times. And I did mention specifically, I think internal HR policies for corporations need to be very, very seriously revalued to make it far more healthcare oriented. So overall, here's what I would say. Let's get through 2020 with reoriented budgets rather than cost cutting as measures. And I would say use profit margin reductions to stay relevant and to stay afloat. I think it's more important to look at how businesses can thrive rather than grow, so that when 2021 comes, we are both alive and kicking and ready to take the opportunity up.
Great, Shubho. And while you're addressing those, there were a few other questions that has cropped up. While the session is due to end at 12 o'clock, and looking at the group of attendees is still around, so if you guys are all right, I'm going to proceed with addressing some of these questions, because I think having conversations around this is going to be far more meaningful for all of us, right? So next question is also from an anonymous posting. How do distinguish the real normal from publicized hypes, bubbles due to the presumed to be prolonged insecurities? Businesses are having difficulties in balancing risks to change business models, target markets, products, and marketing.
Okay, here's the way I look at it.
Yeah.
I did mention at the beginning, I wonder if there is a new normal, or have we been living it in the past already for about 10 years, if you ask me. Here's the difference. This risk mitigation principle is actually a fundamental tenet of capitalism, which is dying, according to me. Rules, bureaucracies, regulations, and risk mitigation is how capital is preserved and how capital is passed on. In the new economy, there is no such thing as risk mitigation. There needs to be intelligent attempt, because the problem is opportunities don't sit along for long. Capital can. So if I really look at how you should attempt to look at strategies and separate out the hype from the reality, look back into your own business. Look back into the trends that you've seen with your business successes over the past few years, and try and see where the relevance of that business lies in modern times. Because, like I said earlier, there is a very, very big shift in relevance of business and the kinds of businesses that'll be out there.
I think if I can add on to that a little bit, to the question also, and to what you were saying, while you're trying to kind of look at the current changes, that could be a balance between hype or the bubble. The anchor is also very important of what you are doing right now. And that is what will probably carry you for the longer term. But from a shorter term perspective, is that agility of the business to contextualize. All right, let's move on to the next question. This is from Sean. Regarding the pricing strategy mentioned before, may I know, besides getting into a price war with the competitors or lower the prices, are there any strategies that corporates could consider? And I think you addressed this a little bit just now, Shubho.
Yeah, I did it earlier as well. I think one has to, again, you reimagine where the relevance of the product lies. Is it an essential? Is it an indulgence? That's one factor. Secondly, reassess what people's needs and wants are going to be like. And that's going to be an important aspect. Third, start looking at maintaining a certain level of sales rather than getting into market share issues. Try and look at your own business and see what you need to sustain and thrive through 2020. It's not about a price war. It's not about shifting market shares. It's about staying alive and relevant to take charge of 2021, where opportunities will rise. So it's not going to be a year where there'll be great results on growth, etc. I think anybody who has been able to get through the year with a sensible balance sheet will be well equipped to take on 2021.
Thanks,
So like I said before, Ashran, sorry, I did not say let's go and bring down our prices.
Yeah, you did.
Let's get into a price war. I said let's make the value proposition in our prices relevant in multiple ways, both through messaging, role of brand in people's lives, and the actual price tag.
I think the key word that you're saying here is value, right? How can you wrap around the product that value? And if it has an embedded pricing element to it, literally, then that's fine. But that value component cannot be discounted. It's not just about cutting down prices.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah. Next question. Keep it coming, guys. Any explanation on why the basic food and ingredients is the category one where consumers end up to start using e-wallet, non-cash instead of other category? This was referenced on slide 36, and perhaps Ayn, you want to bounce off back to slide 36?
Let's see. Sorry, we're just moving this in this way. I would imagine that this is where some of the basic foods and ingredients is where people are making purchases online, if anything, and that may be some indication of where e-wallet purchase is being consumed, is being used. But at this stage, we don't have. I think we would be able to see more of this pattern as we look into how people continue over the course of the subsequent weeks. So I would imagine that we will be able. We'll try and address this actually in the next webinar.
Great, thanks.
Sorry, I have a question, Ashran and Ayn, just to add on to. Are you going to change the questions asked and the kind of data points you will pick up? Or is there a number that will, or a set of questions that will carry forward as a baseline and others that will get added on top to bring us new perspectives?
Yes, that's basically the plan. For us to be able to do this effectively, we also have to be sensitive to the changes that are happening over time. So some questions will eventually no longer serve its purpose, I suppose, and then some questions will be relevant to track those other types of transitions that come into place. So we are looking, which is also why we are looking at additional questions that we can add in. And when we are presenting, so for the next webinar, we won't be necessarily presenting the same categories that we're sharing this time around. There will be certain elements that we will be introducing just to basically add nuance to it, because it's by that time we would be able to do a little bit more of comparison of how some of the behaviors have changed. So in respect of some of the data that we chose not to share today is simply because it wouldn't really bring much value unless we start to see those changes, unless we are able to see some sort of time comparison. So we will introduce some of those other data points in the next in the webinar next month.
Great. But to sum it all up with regards to Shubho's question, that essentially is the spirit of CIC. Yeah. And as I mentioned earlier on, we would need it to be relevant in the context. It's not just about being static. And that's why community inputs within the circle members is actually very important. And then that's why we decided to take a community approach as opposed to just publishing of reports. And we do value that process. And I personally appreciate the line of questions that has been coming in. And I do hope that this continues and builds up momentum as we move forward.
If I may add, okay, so since there was a question about whether, since Bajmo mentioned, whether we're going to be looking, how we're going to be looking at it, how we're going to be treating this in the coming webinars and the coming reports. So basically, as mentioned, we are tracking that path. So we are not at the new normal yet, but we are tracking the path to the new normal. So taking into account all the insecurities and the priorities and looking into how some of these will affect things like shopping behavior, media consumption, at home behavior, which we haven't shared yet, and of course, as we have seen, the purchase and activity intention. So we've got monthly changes. We will look at monthly changes in terms of the state of mind of consumers and see how then that also, what relationship that has with the weekly patterns of consumer behavior. So this, in fact, so as you can see, this very week we are looking at another set of basically evaluating the changes in the state of mind. So we will have something new to share in June when we have way more data and way more insights as well for us to work on.
Thanks, Zain, for that. So I hope that gives a picture with regards to where we're going this through. So there's another question. Although many still depend on physical stores, but could browsing time in the store reduce, hence limiting impulse buy opportunities? This is, anyone wants to take this up?
Yeah, well, I could. Excellent observation. I totally agree with you. It might happen very, very soon.
Yes.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I think that's one thing that we are interested to find that out as well. And it's one of the things that we are testing out. In fact, once you have access to Voyager, it's going to be, hopefully this is going to be one of the offerings as well that will be available to users. What we have shown you so far is data that is based on survey. Which is just one channel of data collection that we use on our within Dattel as part of our consumer intelligence. So we take an omni-channel approach, and one of it is actually looking at movement data as well. So that will be interesting, especially if you're talking about time spent in physical stores, where we will be able to look at where people go and how much time they actually spend at each location of visit, particularly grocery stores or any of the other physical stores or any other place, or time spent traveling between places for that matter. So these are some of the other things later on that we will, if not immediately add to this particular study, it's definitely going to be something that will be available for users to explore on their own time once we have more data and once we start seeing the new normal setting in.
Also, I think, if I may add, Ayn,
yes.
Sorry, Ashran.
No, go ahead.
Online browsing has already become big, and
yes.
I think rather than the touch, feel, sensory aspects of impulse purchase, there is every chance that a lot of impulse purchase could move into online spaces. I also think online marketplaces are going to become big, where you can actually browse by category rather than necessarily only by brand. So yeah, it's a great question, and I do think that will happen, but I think it'll benefit online shopping and browsing.
I think good, interesting that you highlighted that, Shubho, because I think that was when one of our earlier conversations when we first met before came about also, in terms of how the product correlation between consumer behaviors buying some things online too.
Right.
Another question, and this is from Andy. Geographical distribution / the density of population in Indonesia should have influenced the spread of the virus, hence in the shaping of the new normal. Can it benefit companies in recovering or growing their business post the apocalypse?
Look, all these factors will be important in terms of distribution, in terms of supply chain. All these things will become important factors. I'm not sure I want to hazard an off-the-cuff kind of an answer. I haven't thought about this very deeply.
Sure.
But the truth is both. See, for example, if I take it from a supply chain, I know it doesn't answer the question directly, but perhaps it'll give you a perspective to think about. Supply chain has become a very important aspect. So if I sit down and wait for parts to come in from China and China has another virus, or if I wait for stuff to come in from India and India has a virus, suddenly my supply chain is disrupted while my marketing is not, or my market is not. And that can lead to pretty grave consequences. So I do think that in the name of efficiency, there will be higher costs that some companies will engage in to set up factories and production facilities closer to where they sell from, because that mitigates that risk. So I know it's not a direct answer, but I was just drawing a parallel on the other side. Perhaps you need to think a little more to answer that.
But I think one thing to note for all the participants that's still around too, that if any of these questions in the Q&A block interest you, we would like you to kind of put a little thumbs up to that question so that we know there's many more people that share similar sentiments, and then we can take that into account in our whole process going through. Okay? From Ivan, from PT Awina, will the new normal post-COVID stay long or will it be a short one? And we'll be in a situation pre-COVID-19. What will be the long-term significant changes post-COVID-19 and which will be different from pre-COVID-19? And I think if I can just preempt with regards to this question, I think the conversation that we have today is about tracking that through, possibly not go back to the actual norm, but somewhere in between, and why we're phrasing it to anchor in identifying the areas of insecurities and how it extrapolates is kind of trying to see this going through. But I think as a business, it's always looking at your best and worst case scenario and kind of balancing the act between that front. So I hope that addresses from Ivan. There's a question from Leonard that says, do you see this pandemic as a catalyst for IR 4.0 adoption for businesses? Let me do a quick reaction. If anyone else wants to add in, please feel free. IR 4.0, I will need to clarify the framing for this because I've seen people use this in many extremes. If you talk about automation and stuff, that requires investment and other points to that, that may be slowed down a little bit. But I've seen people using IR 4.0 in the lens of to the digital marketplace, which I think is a little bit 50-50. So I think it's more looking very foundational, digitalization in terms of trying to get to market and operationalizing things. There will be a slight bump up, but costs will always be a factor within things too. Does Shubho or Ayn, do you want to add anything to this?
If I may just add, I think it will lead to greater localization. And I think I was mentioning supply chain earlier, and I think it's an important step moving towards, like I said, it would be more cost inefficient in the beginning, but I think it'll lead to greater localization and perhaps stimulation for the economy at a faster rate.
Okay, great, thanks. So there's a couple more questions, but we will then try to address that with you guys individually. I think we've exceeded about 20 minutes into the session. And let me just do some wrap-up housekeeping. We are going to be continuing this conversation, yeah. But the next session is actually going to be on the 19th of May, which is going to be focused on a member sharing session. So as I mentioned about the spirit of CIC, we wanted the circle members to share because some of us may overlap in verdict industries. Some of us could draw inspiration from what other parties are doing that could affect within their business itself. So that's part of the value they're trying to put into the table over here. The next session that is going to be an extension of today's discussion, literally, it's going to be on the 2nd of June. But anytime in between, next slide, please, Zain. Please do drop us a line at pathfinder@dattel.asia. We're actually also, for those that have not registered, please do register at cic.dattel.asia, and you will then get an access to today's presentation. Please make sure that once you registered, that the email address is also doesn't go to your spam box, because sometimes that happens. Next, please. And like I mentioned, we value your feedback. And again, it's been a great series of questions and interactions with the audience this morning, this afternoon now. And we're going to be sharing pretty much a link for you guys to give some of their feedbacks and hopefully trigger some of the thoughts that you have. And please, like I mentioned earlier on, if you've got any ideas as, post this webinar in particular, or as you're reading the report after this and so forth, drop us a line so that we can take that into account and carry on to the next conversation. And I would like to extend also to everyone that's still online right now, that if you think you've got a compelling story and you want to pay it forward, you want to share with the rest of the community over here, drop us a line too, and we will outreach to you and to see whether we could have you in the next sharing session. So with that, again, Shubho, Ayn, thank you very much. And for the rest of the audience that's still online, thank you very much for staying on with us. Don't forget, we will be having more of this. Please do share more of your thoughts and inputs so that we can continue to improve these things. And for Siska and Prakai, we'll try and get back to you with some of your questions. Thank you very much. A pleasure to have everyone. Take care. Stay safe.